I grew up in a small town in northern Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and life moved at a slower pace. The town was surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, and the old coal mines on the outskirts served as a reminder of its industrial past. It was quiet, predictable, and safe until the summer of 2003 when everything changed. I was 16 that year, and like most teenagers in town, I spent my summer nights with friends, usually hanging out at someone's house or sneaking down to the quarry to swim. But that night was different. My best friend, Matt, had convinced me to join him for some urban exploration. There was an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, a relic from the mining days. It was rumored to be haunted, but we weren't there for ghosts. We just wanted to see if the stories were true. The warehouse loomed in the distance as we approached, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The air felt cooler near the building, and the surrounding trees seemed unnaturally still. Matt was armed with a flashlight and an old Polaroid camera he'd borrowed from his dad. I carried a backpack with snacks and a first aid kit just in case. We joked about how we were like characters in a bad horror movie, but there was an unspoken tension between us as we stepped through the broken gate. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of rusted machinery, broken pallets, and piles of debris. Our footsteps echoed loudly, and the beam from Matt's flashlight seemed to barely cut through the darkness. We wandered through the main hall, taking pictures and making half-hearted jokes to mask our nervousness. It wasn't long before we noticed something odd. Scattered throughout the warehouse were personal items: an old shoe, a child's doll with a missing eye, a backpack that looked relatively new. At first, we thought they were just random trash left behind by squatters or vandals, but the sheer number of them made us uneasy. They didn't seem scattered randomly. They were placed deliberately, almost like they were markers. We found ourselves drawn to the back of the building, where a massive set of steel doors stood ajar. Beyond them was a staircase leading down into the basement. I hesitated, but Matt, ever the thrill-seeker, insisted we check it out. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The basement was worse than I imagined. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mold and something metallic. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was slick with water that had seeped in over the years. But what really caught our attention was the series of rooms branching off the main hallway. Each one was small, about the size of a storage closet, with thick metal doors that could be bolted from the outside. "Why would a warehouse need rooms like this?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water. I didn't have an answer. The place felt wrong, like it had been used for something other than storage or mining operations. The last room in the hallway was slightly larger than the others, and its door was partially open. Matt pushed it the rest of the way and we stepped inside. The room was empty, except for a single chair bolted to the floor in the center. A thick chain hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though it had just been disturbed. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time that night, I wanted to leave. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. Matt nodded, for once not arguing with me. But as we turned to leave, his flashlight flickered and died. We were plunged into darkness. Panic set in immediately. I fumbled for my phone, but the battery had drained earlier in the evening, and I'd forgotten to charge it. Matt cursed under his breath as he banged the flashlight against his palm, trying to bring it back to life. That's when we heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from the hallway. It was slow and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. We froze, our ears straining to pinpoint the source. "Maybe it's the wind," Matt whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "There's no wind down here." The scraping grew louder, closer. My heart pounded as I grabbed Matt's arm and pulled him toward the door. We stumbled blindly down the hallway, using the walls to guide us. The sound followed us, growing more erratic, like whatever was making it was gaining speed. We finally reached the staircase and scrambled up to the main floor. Matt's flashlight sputtered back to life just as we emerged into the open air. We didn't stop running until we reached his car parked on the side of the road. Neither of us spoke on the drive home. The warehouse felt like a bad dream, one we were both eager to forget, but forgetting wasn't an option. The next morning, the local news reported that a body had been discovered near the warehouse. A hiker had found it in the woods about a mile away, partially buried in a shallow grave. The victim was a young woman, her identity unknown, her death recent. Matt and I didn't tell anyone about what we'd seen or heard that night. We didn't want to be involved, and we convinced ourselves that whatever had happened was unrelated to our visit. But deep down, we knew better. Over the next few weeks, more bodies were discovered, all within a few miles of the warehouse. The police issued warnings to stay away from the area, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was the work of a serial killer. Others believed the warehouse was cursed. Whatever the truth, the town was never the same. Matt moved away the following year and we lost touch. I stayed, trying to move on with my life, but the memories of that night haunted me. Every so often, I drive past the warehouse, its broken windows staring back at me like empty eyes. One evening, about 5 years after it all happened, I saw something that made my blood run cold. As I passed the warehouse, I noticed a faint light flickering in one of the windows. Could have been squatters or kids messing around, but it felt like something more. For the first time since that night, I considered going back, if only to face the demons I'd been running from. But as I sat in my car, staring at the dark silhouette of the building, I realized I didn't need to go back. The past was a place better left unexplored. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some truths are better left buried. Moving to a small town in Ohio after my breakup seemed like the perfect fresh start. The duplex I rented was affordable, quiet, and had a cozy charm. Sharing the space with Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived next door, didn't seem like a big deal. She was polite, always quick with a smile, but I quickly noticed her strange habits. She'd spend hours on her porch, sipping tea while scanning the neighborhood with sharp eyes. On my first day, she leaned over the fence and said, "Lock your doors every night, and never go out after dark." Her words seemed odd but harmless. I chalked them up to an older woman's paranoia and carried on with unpacking. It was the middle of my second week when I first heard it. Late at night, a strange, rhythmic thudding echoed through the walls. At first, I thought it was an old house settling or maybe a branch tapping on her window. But as the minutes passed, the noise grew louder and more insistent, like someone hammering in slow, deliberate strokes. The next morning, I casually asked Mrs. Thompson about it. Her response was curt. "Old houses make all kinds of sounds," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I tried to brush it off, but the noises continued. Some nights there were muffled voices, barely audible but undeniably there. A few times I even thought I heard crying. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I started paying closer attention to her routines. She'd leave the house only for a few hours each week, always carrying large bags that she loaded into the trunk of her car. When she returned, the bags were gone. Once, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a large padlock in her shopping bag. One rainy night, the thudding was so loud it woke me. It sounded like it was coming from her basement. I got up, peered out my window, and saw her silhouette through the curtains. She was standing motionless, staring down at something in the dim light. Unable to shake the uneasy feeling, I decided to call the police. When they arrived, Mrs. Thompson greeted them with her usual sweet demeanor, inviting them inside. They didn't stay long and left shortly after. One of the officers reassured me they found nothing suspicious. That should have been enough for me to drop it, but a part of me couldn't let it go. The noises persisted, and my imagination ran wild. What if she was hiding something or someone in her basement? The breaking point came a month later. My power went out during a storm, and as I lit candles, I noticed a faint glow coming from Mrs. Thompson's basement window. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. Crouching beside the window, I peered inside. The sight made my blood run cold. A man was shackled to the wall, his clothes filthy and torn. His head hung low, and his lips moved as if he were whispering a prayer. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. My flashlight clattered to the ground, the noise echoing in the night. That's when the basement light snapped off. I ran back to my house, shaking as I locked the door and called the police. This time, I demanded they search her basement thoroughly. When they arrived, Mrs. Thompson's calm demeanor cracked. She argued with them, insisting they had no right to enter her basement. But after some tense moments, they forced the door open. The smell hit first, a sickening mix of damp earth and decay. What they found made national headlines. Her basement was a nightmare. Shackles hung from the walls, and makeshift cages lined the corners. There were tools scattered everywhere, some rusted, others stained. They found 2 people alive, barely clinging to life, and the remains of others who hadn't been so lucky. Mrs. Thompson was arrested on the spot. Investigators later uncovered that she had been kidnapping and imprisoning people for years. Her victims were drifters, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. She had a meticulous system to avoid suspicion. The ordeal haunted me long after I left that town. Sometimes, I dream of her basement, the faint glow of that window, and the man's hollow eyes. Even now, I wonder how many others might have ignored the signs before me, and how many secrets like hers are hidden in plain sight. I was born and raised in Nebraska, a place where the horizon seems endless, and the sky is bigger than anywhere else on Earth. After graduating college, I landed a job as a veterinary technician and moved into a small, remote farmhouse on the outskirts of Omaha. The house came with a barn, old, decrepit, and leaning slightly to one side, like a tired man after a long day. The landlord, Mr. Keller, was an elderly man with a permanent frown etched on his face. He warned me that the barn was unsafe and told me to keep my distance. "It's old and full of junk," he grumbled. "You don't want to go poking around in there." I didn't think much of it at first, but something about the barn unnerved me. Its rusted hinges screeched in the wind, and at night, I could swear I heard faint noises coming from inside, soft creaks and the occasional thud. I chalked it up to the old wood settling or stray animals seeking shelter. It was my 3rd night in the farmhouse when I first noticed something truly unsettling. I was reading in bed when my dog, Scout, began growling at the window. His ears were pinned back, and his hackles stood on end. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, getting up to look outside. The barn loomed in the darkness, its silhouette barely visible under the crescent moon. Scout barked once, sharply, his gaze fixed on the barn doors. I tried to calm him down, but his unease only grew. Eventually, I decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. Scout followed close behind, his tail low and wagging nervously. As I approached the barn, I heard it, a faint shuffling noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart raced, but I forced myself to move closer. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The noise stopped. I swung the barn doors open, revealing an empty interior. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Scout sniffed the ground, growling softly, but there was nothing there. Just an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Over the next few weeks, the noises became more frequent. Sometimes it was soft whispers. Other times, it sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, I decided to explore the barn in daylight. Armed with gloves, a flashlight, and a crowbar, I began sifting through the piles of junk. Most of it was harmless, old tools, broken furniture, and stacks of rotting hay. But in one corner, buried under a tarp, I found something that made my blood run cold. A large wooden crate, nailed shut. The crate was heavy, but I managed to pry it open. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. They depicted a young woman tied to a chair, her face bruised and terrified. The background was unmistakable. She was in the barn. I felt sick. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why was this evidence left here, forgotten and untouched? I took the photos to the local police station, hoping for answers. The officer on duty, a grizzled man named Detective Harris, examined them with a grim expression. "This isn't the first time we've had reports about that property," he said. "But these photos, they're new. We'll investigate." Days turned into weeks, but the police found nothing. They questioned Mr. Keller, who claimed he didn't know anything about the photos or the noises in the barn. "That place has always been creepy," he said, "but I never saw or heard anything unusual." I considered moving out, but something kept me there, a stubborn need for closure. Then, one night, everything changed. It was past midnight when I woke to the sound of Scout barking frantically. The barn doors were wide open, and a faint light flickered inside. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, dialing 911 as I cautiously approached. "Stay on the line," the operator said. Inside the barn, the air was freezing, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. The light was coming from a lantern on the floor, next to a fresh set of muddy footprints. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing. A figure stepped out of the shadows. A man, his face obscured by a hood. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The man lunged at me, but Scout sprang into action, barking and snapping. I stumbled back, dropping my phone, and scrambled for the barn doors. Scout chased the man deeper into the barn, his barks growing fainter. Suddenly, everything went silent. I ran back inside, calling for Scout. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the barn. Then I saw him, Scout, lying motionless on the ground. "No!" I screamed, rushing to his side. He was breathing, but barely. I grabbed him and ran out of the barn, not stopping until I reached the safety of the house. The police arrived minutes later, but the man was gone. Scout survived, but he was never the same. The police continued their investigation but found no evidence of the man's identity. Mr. Keller sold the property shortly after, claiming it was more trouble than it was worth. As for me, I moved to the city and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the barn's rusted hinges creaking in the wind, and I wonder, who was that man, and what other secrets did the barn hold? It was supposed to be a regular night shift at the warehouse. Nothing special, just a few hours of stacking boxes and keeping track of inventory. But it quickly turned into something I'll never forget. I worked as a night shift manager at a distribution warehouse in a quiet part of town. The company wasn't the biggest, but it was reliable. Most nights, it was just me and a handful of others working the late hours to ensure everything was packed up and ready for delivery the next day. The routine had become second nature to me, but tonight, something felt different. I first noticed it when I walked into the main warehouse floor. The lights flickered briefly as I passed under them, but that wasn't unusual. The building was old, and the wiring had its quirks. But then I noticed the pallets in the back of the room, piled higher than I'd ever seen. Usually, we kept things organized, with everything neatly stacked and labeled, but tonight there was chaos. Boxes were haphazardly tossed together, as if someone had been rushing. I walked over to inspect. The boxes were labeled with various shipment numbers, but one box in particular caught my attention. It was strangely out of place, No label, just a plain brown box with no markings at all. I checked around to see if anyone had left it there by mistake. No one else was in sight. I picked it up, feeling the weight in my hands. It wasn't heavy, but it was dense, and there was something inside that rattled as I shook it gently. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to open it. The contents were wrapped in thick, dark plastic. I peeled it away carefully, revealing several smaller boxes, tightly packed together. But what really caught me off guard was what I found at the very bottom. Stacks of cash, bundled together with rubber bands. A lot of it. I froze, staring at the money. My mind raced. It didn't make sense. How did this end up in a warehouse shipment? Who would leave this here? Just then, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I quickly shoved the box back into the corner, out of sight, and turned around. It was Kevin, one of the other workers. He was still in his uniform, looking a bit pale. "You all right?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. "Yeah, just got distracted. Didn't realize how late it was getting," I said, trying to act casual. Kevin nodded, his eyes briefly glancing toward the stacks of boxes. "I heard something strange earlier," he said, lowering his voice. "One of the delivery trucks was late, and when it finally showed up, the driver looked off, like he was in a hurry. I'm telling you, something's weird about tonight." I nodded slowly, trying to hide my own unease. "You're not wrong," I said, my mind racing, but I didn't say anything more about the box. There was no way I was going to involve him in whatever mess this was. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The warehouse felt different, quieter, even though I knew the usual noises of the building should have been present. The hum of the refrigeration unit, the creak of the overhead lights, the low murmur of machinery. But tonight, all of that was gone. Around midnight, I decided to take a quick walk around the perimeter of the warehouse, hoping the cold air would clear my head. As I stepped outside, I noticed a car parked near the loading dock. It wasn't one of the regular vehicles, and I couldn't recognize the make or model. It looked out of place, almost too nice for the rough part of town. I went to investigate. The car was empty, but as I peered through the window, I saw a briefcase lying on the passenger seat. The briefcase was locked, but I could make out the shape of something large inside. A sense of dread settled in my stomach. Why was it parked here, and who did it belong to? I turned back toward the building, my instincts telling me to go back inside. But just as I reached the door, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure was standing by the side of the warehouse, obscured by shadows. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure was tall and had a steady, deliberate posture. For a moment, I thought about calling out, but something stopped me. Then the figure began to move, walking swiftly toward the back of the warehouse. I hesitated, then turned and rushed inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't want to be paranoid. Maybe it was just another delivery driver or a contractor coming in late, but something about it felt wrong. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The truck driver, the briefcase, the strange man. Everything was adding up to something I couldn't explain. When my shift ended, I was ready to leave. But as I went to collect my things, I noticed something else strange. The box I had hidden earlier was gone. In its place was a note, written hastily in black ink. "Leave it alone. You've seen too much." I stared at the note for a long time. My heart pounded. Whoever had left it had known what I had found, and now they were warning me to stay quiet. But what did that mean? What had I stumbled into? I didn't know who was behind it, but I had a sinking feeling that I was caught in something much bigger than just a missing shipment. I left the warehouse that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about the money in the box, the briefcase, and the warning. What if it wasn't just about the shipment? What if it was something much darker? Something criminal that could get me hurt if I wasn't careful. The next day, I quit my job at the warehouse. I never went back, and I never got any answers. The briefcase, the money, and the mysterious man remained a part of my past that I could never fully escape. Every now and then, I hear stories of similar incidents, strange shipments, missing people, cryptic notes, but I'll never know if my experience was just coincidence, or if I was close to uncovering something much more dangerous. I've moved on with my life, but every time I pass a warehouse, I can't help but wonder, what really happened that night? I always loved hiking alone. The solitude of the trails was the perfect way to disconnect. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant hum of cicadas, and the towering pines made me feel small in the best way. But my last hike 3 weeks ago changed everything. I'd heard about Pine Hollow Trail through an online hiking forum. It wasn't marked on any official maps, but the regulars swore it was the most beautiful and secluded trail in the state. A hidden gem, they called it. That alone was enough to sell me. The trailhead was just outside a small, nearly forgotten town called Millhaven. I arrived mid-morning, parked my car near a rickety old sign that read Pine Hollow, and strapped on my gear. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of rain. Perfect hiking weather. The first few miles were as beautiful as promised. Dense woods, a bubbling creek, and the occasional wildflower made it seem like something out of a postcard. I passed no one, which wasn't surprising considering the trail's obscurity. Around the 6-mile mark, I reached an overlook. The forest stretched endlessly below, bathed in a golden afternoon light. I took a few photos, drank some water, and decided to push on. There was supposed to be a small waterfall about 3 miles further in, and I didn't want to miss it. That's when things started to feel off. The first oddity was a pile of rocks stacked in a neat little tower right in the middle of the trail. It wasn't unusual for hikers to leave cairns, but this one didn't seem like a marker. It was deliberately placed to block the path, as if someone wanted it noticed. I stepped around it and kept walking. About a quarter-mile later, I found another stack, identical to the first. This time, there was something else. A small, frayed piece of red fabric caught on a branch nearby. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket, fluttering weakly in the breeze. I should have turned back then, but curiosity got the better of me. Besides, I wasn't far from the waterfall. I convinced myself the cairns and fabric were just remnants of some other hikers. Harmless. The trail narrowed and the forest grew denser. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, seemed muted, as if the woods were holding their breath. That's when I saw the boot print. It was fresh, pressed deep into the mud in the middle of the trail, but something about it made my stomach drop. It was too large, the tread unusual, almost military-looking, and there was only one print, as if whoever left it had vanished mid-step. I wasn't alone. My heart started pounding as I scanned the trees. There was nothing but shadows and sunlight filtering through the canopy. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I picked up my pace, practically jogging down the trail. The thought of reaching the waterfall no longer appealed to me. I just wanted to get back to my car. But the cairns kept appearing. Every few hundred feet, another stack of rocks stood in the path, each identical to the last. It felt impossible, like someone or something was moving ahead of me, resetting them as I went. My breathing grew shallow, and my hands trembled as I gripped my water bottle like a weapon. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. I knew I needed to get out of the woods before nightfall. My head swiveled constantly, scanning for movement, for anything out of place. Then I heard it, a twig snapping behind me. I froze. It wasn't the sound of a random branch falling. It was deliberate, the unmistakable crunch of someone stepping on dry wood. Slowly, I turned, my eyes darting between the trees. First, I saw nothing. Then, about 30 yards away, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. They were tall, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. Their face was obscured by the shadows, but their posture was unnerving. Too still, too deliberate. They didn't move toward me. They just stood there, watching. I don't remember deciding to run. My body moved on instinct, my legs pumping as I bolted down the trail. My backpack bounced violently with each step, but I didn't dare stop to adjust it. The trail blurred as adrenaline took over. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps heavy and fast. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Panic clawed at my chest, and I fought to keep my balance on the uneven ground. Finally, I saw it, the parking lot. My car was just beyond the trailhead, a beacon of salvation. I fumbled for my keys as I sprinted toward it. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the door shut, locking it just as something slammed into the rear window. I screamed. The figure was there, their face pressed against the glass. They wore a mask, a crude, homemade thing that looked like it was stitched together from burlap. Their breath fogged the window as they stared at me, unmoving. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. The tires squealed as I tore out of the parking lot, gravel spraying in my wake. My heart hammered as I sped down the empty road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. By the time I reached the nearest gas station, I was shaking so badly I could barely get out of the car. I told the clerk to call the police and waited, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee as I tried to calm down. When the officers arrived, I led them back to the trailhead. My car was the only one there. They searched the woods but found nothing. No footprints, no cairns, no masked figure. The experience has stayed with me, a constant weight on my chest. I haven't been hiking since. I'm not sure I ever will again. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the mask pressed against my window. I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for their next hiker to wander too far.